So, with that said, I'm wondering if you could just start by telling me how you became involved. I read the Wikipedia page about the Moscow Times, which I found confusing in how it's written.
It is pretty confusing. I always keep telling myself that I have to ask someone to redo it in a proper way, but I always forget about it. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me tell you something then. I'm a journalist from Holland. My background is in journalism. I was editor-in-chief of a weekly magazine in the Netherlands, but for like, what is it, 8-9 years, and I had told my boss at the publishing house I worked for that basically I wanted to look around for something new. And more or less by accident, around the same time, a delegation of the Russian Union of Journalists visited the Netherlands. And they made a tour among publishing houses. And they also came to, because we were a well-known magazine in the Netherlands. So they came to me. And this was the first time in my life that I met Russians.
Yeah.
Now I have to tell you that
What year was it? What year?
This was in 1988.
Okay. Late Perestroika, yeah.
Yes, it was Perestroika time. And I must say, I have a very left-wing background.
Okay.
Since childhood, I was a member of the Dutch Marxist-Leninist movement. Funny enough, the China part, you had this
I remember, yes.
Pro-Chinese and pro-Russians. I was on the pro-Chinese side, Mao Zedong.
Okay.
So I was a well-known sort of radical in the Netherlands. So I started talking to these guys, and they were, of course, very excited what was going on in Russia. And they said, "Why don't you come to Russia? We want to start up a new, publication." And they were obviously looking for money and so on. But of course, I've followed in the news what was going on in Russia: Gorbachev, Perestroika, Glasnost, and the whole stuff. I thought, well, maybe that could be interesting. I was looking for a new horizon, and I have a long background in war journalism. As a journalist, I've visited many wars, traveled all over the world. And I'd been for like 8 years in Russia, in Holland. I was married. I had a small child. My wife wasn't too crazy. I would go back to war journalism, but this seemed a good sort of a good alternative. It was exciting, but it was not a war,
Right.
So I took the idea to my bosses at this publishing house. I called VNU. It was a very big Dutch publishing group, they were intrigued by the idea, new marketing, a market opening up, and so on. And also they said, "Well, you are a communist, so you probably know how to deal with these people." So basically that's how it all started. So I traveled to Moscow. My first visit coincided with the first big rock concert organized in Luzhniki Stadium. There was some Bon Jovi was there and some other.
Yes.
It was like a very big. The first time a big rock concert was organized in Luzhniki.
And You know, there's a podcast about that the Scorpions who were part of this, and whether or not the song "Winds of Change" was written by the CIA. You know this, right? You know this?
No, I don't know this. I didn't know this.
Yeah. So there was this. It's a long podcast about this, and it involves that concert. If you want, I'll send you a reference.
Yeah. Interesting. Anyway, so and I liked it. From the moment I landed in Moscow, I was fascinated by the place, and so I told my wife, "Let's go to Moscow." Of course, my wife, because we had a 7-month-old baby, so she was a little shocked, but but she is also an adventurous type. So, and she's Dutch, so so we decided to go. Of course, when I arrived, I quickly found out. In those days, I was very naive about Russia. That these so-called journalists, of course, were in fact all KGB guys. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
They were, of course, KGB guys. But anyway, in those days, in the beginning, you could only start something in the form of a joint venture. That, like in China, you have to team up with you had to team up with a local state organization.
Right.
So we did this joint venture, and the first project I launched was called Moscow Magazine.
Magazine. Okay.
Yeah, this was the first glossy magazine ever published in Russia.
Right. And this was a joint venture of your Dutch publishing group and who?
And the Russian Union of Journalists.
I see. Okay, so it wasn't you personally. You were representing the Dutch publishing group.
That's how I came.
Yeah. Okay. And this glossy journal was for distribution in hotels, I assume.
Yeah, it was. It had both an English and a Russian language. Edition, so 2 editions. And you're right. It was distribution in hotels, the Russian, of course, in kiosks and so on. It was basically, New York Magazine.
Yeah.
So it was sort of the Russian answer to New York Magazine.
Okay. So it was a higher level kind of thoughtful journal, correct?
Right. Yeah, it was nice, and we had, some very good contributors, and I invited people from US, like famous journalists, to write about, to visit Russia and to write about Russia, what they saw, and it was quite actually quite an interesting magazine. But of course, it was not a commercial enterprise, because the magazine was printed in the Netherlands, in hard currency, and then was sold in Russia in rubles. But the ruble was losing. Those were the days of the hyperinflation. So the ruble was nothing. And also the journalists from the Union of Journalists were not real journalists, as I said. So they really didn't contribute anything.
Right. What were they trying to do? What do you think? Why would they want this?
They wanted to make money. This was really the beginning of Glasnost and Perestroika, and they all had this crazy idea that if you work with a foreign company, you immediately get rich. So the first things they asked is, when do we go on vacation, and what car can we buy? And so it was it was funny and naive, you know. It was
Right.
in those days the naivety that they had about what capitalism meant, you know,
Right. Right.
uh, because they had been raised with this image that, you know, the guy with a big cigar and dollar bills coming out of his pocket, you know,
Yeah.
uh,
Yep.
the cartoons in the Soviet newspapers. And they thought, now we work for an international company. Well, you know, we don't have to, you know, work was not in their mind at all, you know.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right.
it was really, of course, it was, you know, for me, it was very difficult because they were useless to me.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
but at the same time, it was very endearing to see the naivety of those early days, you know.
Yeah.
People
Yeah.
didn't realize that capitalism is actually quite a complicated system and that you have to get up early and work hard, and maybe then you make some money.
Yeah. 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 That's interesting. So, how long did that magazine exist?
About 1.5 years.
Okay, so what years were we talking about?
So it was launched in the fall of '89
Yeah.
till the beginning of '92. No, about
Okay.
89, 90. It was no, it was the beginning of. I said wrong. '89. I arrived, so it was launched in the spring of '90,
Yeah.
and then 1.5 years.
So when by the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, was it also?
Yeah, it was right there. It was right
Yeah.
at the moment when the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when Yeltsin climbed on the tanks. It was right
Right.
at that moment. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And so, did you cover those events as a journalist then?
Well, we covered it somewhat in this magazine, but it was a monthly magazine.
Right.
So, but you know, I of course, because I was the only Dutch journalist at that moment to be in Moscow,
Right.
I turned into a de facto correspondent for all the Dutch, you know, media, television, radio, newspapers. So I was like covering those events day and night, but more as a correspondent than in that magazine, because with those long deadlines,
Right.
we could, of course, we followed the story, but not on a day-to-day basis.
Right. So, as a person with your political background, as a communist, as you'd said,
Well,
how did you feel about what was going on with the dissolution of the Soviet Union?
yeah. Well, of course, what the most fascinating thing, of course, coming to Russia from Holland, um, uh, is that my friends and people I met in Russia. As you know, you met people at the kitchen table, and the WhatsApp
Yeah.
photo would be on the table, and so on. And they would start telling these horroring stories about their families and gulags and prosecutions, because in those days that was the first time they really could talk about it openly, as you know.
Right.
So, within a couple of weeks, of course, I came to realize, that this whole idea of communism was a total scheme and a flop, and just, yeah. I knew of course, I knew about Stalin and everything, but once I was a young man in Holland, and we were all caught up in the Vietnam movement, and
Right.
so, and in anti-colonial, the freedom fights of all the people in Latin America and Asia and so on. But when I came to Russia and then heard all these personal stories, and the cynicism about communism, and also, we were in those days, we lived in a very small apartment on Kutuzovsky with all the cockroaches and the empty stores and no bread and no fuel, and standing in line for hours. So it was a crash course about the failure of communism.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So you were then able to kind of join in with the enthusiastic optimism of the time, which was something new was being born. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So apart from these guys of the Union of Journalists, I had one other address with me when I went to Moscow, and that was of the name of the guy is Artemy Troitsky. And I don't know if you ever heard of him.
No.
Well, he's very famous in Russia. Artemy Troitsky is a journalist and a media guy who, in those days, he was the chronicle of the rock and roll scene in Russia.
Okay.
Yes, check him out. Troitsky is his name.
Okay.
He wrote many books on the Soviet underground. He was friends with the Stones and the Beatles, and he knew everyone. He was a cult figure in Moscow. So I got his address from a Dutch journalist, and I went to his house, and basically we quickly became friends. We are still friends, and he introduced me to the Russian alternative scene, so to speak,
right.
and young journalists, young writers, intellectuals, and basically, I stopped working with these people from the Union of Journalists. They still got their salaries and everything, but I created a whole new team of young people, and I made the magazine with those people, with Troitsky and his friends.
I see. And so that sort of began to integrate you more into Russian
Absolutely.
life.
Absolutely. Yeah. So and then and that really, he really introduced me to the interesting Russian life.
Right. And I assume that was all in English, because at that point you didn't speak Russian.
When I came, I didn't speak one word of Russian.
Yeah. In those days, without one word of Russian, it was hard to get around, hard to do much, right?
It was very hard. It was very hard.
Yeah, and where, just on the living level, where did you and your wife shop? Did you shop at the hard currency stores?
Well, somewhat. There was, but there were only one or two Beryoskas. But we actually like, because we had a small baby, so we needed milk powder, we needed diapers, all those things, which were not available. So we shipped them in from Holland.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I remember when I traveled there in those years, these huge suitcases, because I was also living in an apartment, not in a hotel, and had to bring food with me because I couldn't purchase it. Yeah. So
it was, but I mean, looking back, of course, it was tough. I mean, standing up, getting up at 4 a.m. to get some petrol for your car. But of course, it was extremely romantic, because everyone had such a good vibe in those days. Like, the future was there, and everything would be great, and war would end, and peace would come, and how naive were we?
Yes, absolutely. And so when the magazine then went under, then who pulled the plug? Your Dutch publisher?
Yeah, so the Dutch publisher, in the meantime, they actually bought a very big company in the US, a marketing research company. So they switched their focus to the US. And they told me, well, Derk, we like what you do, but really it's not, we don't see it becoming a business. It costs us money. Uh, but we liked it so much in Moscow, and we saw so many foreigners flooding in. And in the meantime, I already had started a little newsletter for the foreign community.
Uh-huh.
It was more like a leaflet sort of thing, It was not a full-blown publication, but it was just, where to shop, what to do, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But people responded really good to it because in those days there was no information, there was no internet, there was nothing. So and that that was doing quite we had a lot of good feedback on that newsletter, and that brought me to the idea to why don't we start a newspaper, like English language newspaper. You have that you have them in many places in the world, in China and Rome and you name it.
Right.
Um, so I came up with this idea of the Moscow Times, and just to be sure, I went to my bosses at this publishing house and I said, I made a business plan. I knew nothing about. I'm a journalist, so I knew
Right.
nothing about business, but I made a business plan, and I went to them and I said, I think this can work. And so the guys looked at it. I said, Derk, it's not our business to fulfill your dreams.
Okay.
So
just out of curiosity, when you did that business plan,
what?
Did you have an estimate of your potential readers, number of readers? I mean, I'm trying to get at like how many, how big that expat community.
We estimated that at that time there were about 30,000 expats in Moscow.
And that's in 1992.
That is in 1992, right?
Okay. Wow.
It was really streaming in by that. I mean, every week,
Right.
company registered, opened up a subsidiary. Don't forget, this was Yeltsin time now.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And what was very important is the laws were changed so that you could set up your own business in those. That was the beginning that a foreign company could just set up their own company. You did not have to do all this joint venture stuff. So that really opened the gates, and foreign companies were flooding in.
Right. And so you were making this pitch to your publishing house that foreigners are flooding in, and we have a unique window here, and they thought it was too small and too little money.
Yeah, and they said the daily newspaper. What are you thinking? So I mean, I understood them, but I thought it was funny. They said we're not in the business to fulfill your dreams.
So you went out to fulfill your dreams yourself, then?
Right, exactly. So that is exactly what happened. So I had a very good friend in the Netherlands. We were together. In Holland is the only country in the world that had a trade union of conscript soldiers.
Wow.
Yes, and they were very militant. They went on strike, and we achieved that soldiers could grow their hair as long as they wanted. It was quite a unique thing, and this guy, friend of mine, was also in this union. I was in this union, so we knew each other very well, remained friends. And I told him about my plan, and he said, "Yeah, let's go for it." He had made some money, and I still had some savings. We had very little money. Our first investment was like 50,000 euros.
Yeah.
And we decided. So we went to the Slaviansky hotel.
Right.
There was a guy called Paul Tatum there.
Yeah, I remember him. Yes.
He was murdered.
Yes.
Later on.
So he was managing the Radisson then, right?
Yeah. But then at that time it was still empty. It was still they were not open even yet. So I said to Paul, I said, okay, if you give us a number of a floor of your hotel rooms, then we make our offices there. Then we publish the newspapers and we advertise the Slaviansky there like a barter. In those days, everything was barter.
Barter, right.
And then we advertise your hotel. When you open, then you become, well known. So we did it. So Paul said, okay, good idea. Let's do it. So we were, our offices were like in a number of hotel rooms. And we bought 2 second-hand Volkswagen vans in Amsterdam and stashed them with Apple computers. We were the first in the world to bring Apple computers to Russia.
Wow. Yeah.
And it wasn't even allowed because there was still a ban to bring technology to Russia. But we just put them in a van.
Yeah.
And we drove those 2 vans with the Apple computers to Moscow. I remember about 100 kilometers or 200 kilometers before Moscow, one of the vans broke down. So the other one had to pull the van all the way to Moscow. That was a really funny enterprise. But we arrived at the Slaviansky hotel, installed ourselves with a group of all, we had about 12 or so young, they are all very young people,
Right. And Russian staff or foreign staff?
It was a mix of Russian and American. And we had a designer from Holland because there was no one could work with Apple, in those days in Russia. And then we had a problem because we had to print this newspaper, daily newspaper.
Right.
So we went to Pravda. I don't know if you've ever been at Ulica Pravda.
Yeah, I actually have. I had an abortive joint venture with some people there. It didn't work out, but
well, as you know, it's the biggest printing facility in Russia. Huge presses. So I come to this director of Pravda, and I say, I'd like to print my newspaper with you. And he says, what circulation? I said, well, 25,000. And he starts laughing. He says, when I push the button to start up the printing press, I have immediately to stop the button again. Because the Pravda is like 5 million.
Right.
And Komsomolskaya Pravda is 6 million. And Izvestia is 10 million. 25,000. It's impossible. But I was, of course, you have to be creative, and I said, well, this is the future of newspaper publishing, and this and that, and we will pay you if necessary in hard currency. And then he said, you are from Holland, aren't you? I said, yeah. In Holland, they make very good cheese. I said, yes. Maybe you can help us because Pravda, they had their own farm. They had everything, hotels, farms.
Right.
That's how these conglomerates work. And we want to make cheese because we have cows and we want to make cheese. So if you help us to make cheese, I will print your newspaper.
Wow.
So I brought in some experts from Holland who indeed advised them, with what type of equipment and so on. And they started to print our newspaper.
Wow. Wow. It's and suddenly the 25,000 run wasn't such a big problem for them because they got something they wanted, right? Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. Do you think he had that in mind from the beginning? Just curious.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I think he was. I mean, I think he was so surprised to see a foreigner show up at his doorstep. This was first time in his life that a commercial. Because also the price. So I said, "What is the price?" He looked at me. "What is the price?" And we don't have prices. In the social system, they just print. I mean, it's all.
By state order, right?
So basically, he asked me, "What can you pay?"
Yeah.
It was. Yeah. I mean, that was. Those days were really amazing.
Yeah. And what was your business model? Was it the advertising?
That was the idea. Of course. It turned out to be much more difficult than I had ever imagined, and not being a publisher.
Right.
So the idea was indeed circulation for free circulation. We were also probably the first free circulation newspaper in the world. Later, that became a model with metro newspapers and so on.
Right.
But our idea was free circulation, and then advertising indeed, because the expats had the hard currency in those days.
Right.
And as you may remember, I don't know, many restaurants had two doors.
For foreigners and for Russians.
Yeah, like Pizza Hut and McDonald's.
Right. So, they had the hard currency side and the ruble side.
Right. So, and of course, the foreigners could pay for hotels. They were the rich people around,
Right.
So they were. So for restaurants, travel, shops, and so on, foreigners weren't interesting. That's what I figured. And also, job opportunities became interesting because all these foreign companies who opened offices, they needed Russian employees.
Right.
They needed English-speaking Russian employees.
Right.
Because all the people that started working didn't speak Russian,
Right.
All the foreigners that came in. So the Moscow Times, we actually, most of our readers were Russian, because it was a very good tool for them to get in touch with Western companies.
So the ads revenue was for want ads and for promotion of the restaurants and travel services and so on. Yeah.
But of course, my forecasts were way too optimistic, and we had a real team. I mean, it was small, but still, it was we could not cover the costs. So for 2 years we were really, really struggling, and every month we had a pile of invoices, and we would pull,
which one will we pay? This one?
Yeah, exactly. And in the end, it was so critical that I had a very nice house in Holland, in Amsterdam, and we had to sell. The choice was either stay and go full out and try to make it work, or just close and leave. And we sold our house in Amsterdam, and so basically closed the door behind us. We couldn't go back. We sold our house.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And my partner, our friend in Holland, put in basically most of his money. And then my wife said, because she said we should start a women's magazine.
Uh-huh. Huh.
My wife, Ellen is her name.
Uh-huh.
And she said, because there were only two women magazines in Russia. One was called Kristianka, which stands for the farmer's woman.
Right.
And the other was Rabotnitsa, which stands
Right.
for
For the working woman. Yeah.
factory woman. And
Yeah.
those magazines were exactly as you may think they were,
Yeah. Yeah.
So then we started thinking about a women's magazine. And then I said, then we should do Cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
And we chased Hearst all over the world to try to get this license, which was very tough because they just had done a joint venture with Izvestia. They had done a sort of English thing with Izvestia, which was a total disaster.
But it was under the name of Cosmopolitan?
No. This was before we went to them. They had.
I see.
They had a thing with Izvestia.
I see.
But they
had bad experience already.
Exactly. They were very skeptical, had very bad experience. But anyway, we convinced them. And that saved us basically because Cosmopolitan, which was launched in 1994. So Moscow Times was launched in 1992.
Yeah.
And 2 years later, Cosmopolitan was launched, and that basically saved the day.
I see. So you launched Cosmopolitan under license from the Hearst.
No, in a joint venture.
Oh, okay. Okay. With them and you. And so who provided the content then?
Well, we used most photography from Cosmopolitan and some articles, but from the very beginning, we did a lot of our own content, Russian content, because it's very hard to, the Russian, certainly in those days, the Russian style of living of women was so different from those in the US that you could not just copy or translate articles. You had to find your own angle to it.
Right. So
the topics were the same. It was like, fashion, sex, lifestyle.
Right. And so Cosmopolitan then was sold at kiosks and newsstands.
Well, actually, Cosmopolitan basically created the market of magazine in Russia.
Wow.
So, because there was nothing, there was no, of course, Kristianka and Rabotnica were sold through kiosks, but that was all very old-fashioned and very slow. So what we did, I remember the first circulation was 50,000, and we put ads in the newspaper and said, you can buy the magazines from us, boxes of magazines.
Right.
So, and it was such a sensation, this magazine, that people came to us, just young kids, young people, and they would buy a box, and they would go to the metro and stand there, like people were standing in those days at the metro.
Right.
They sold cigarettes and T-shirts and everything there. So they would start selling Cosmopolitans, and then they came back and they bought 2 boxes, and then they came back and bought 3 boxes.
Wow.
And the first edition was 50,000, but in a year we went to almost 1 million copies a month.
Wow.
And so, some of these boys became later the biggest distributors of magazines in Russia. So, first they, bought one box, then two boxes, then they bought a little truck, then they bought 10 trucks, then they shipped it to the regions, and then they become distribution companies. And so the distribution was completely a whole new form of distribution was created by Cosmopolitan. And the same can be said of the advertising industry, because there was no advertising industry. There was there was no fashion industry, so there were no photographers, there were no designers. So everything was built on the success of Cosmopolitan.
And so it sparked this kind of fashion and all that kind of industry was expressed through Cosmopolitan.
Through Cosmopolitan, we had magazines of 800 pages.
Wow.
Issues of 800 pages, 500 to 600 of them advertisements.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it was like printing money.
Yeah. And so at that time you didn't have any competitors.
Zero.
So how long did that last that you didn't have competitors?
Well, so I would say a year or two or three. Three, maybe four. We started launching our own competitors because we knew that this would not be a permanent situation. This was just too good to be true. So we ourselves launched Harper's Bazaar, Good Housekeeping, and so on. Also the first men magazines, Playboy, we launched, and then Men's Health, and then about 3-4 years after we launched Cosmopolitan, Elle came to the market, and they were our first competitor.
Their first real competitor was Elle. Yeah. Where are they from?
French. That's from Paris.
Stupid. Of course, Elle. What am I thinking? Okay. And so you followed the same model with all these, where you got a license for the foreign or a joint venture with a foreign partner, and
some was licensed, some was joint ventures.
Yeah, and then you must have had a really dramatically expanding staff of journalists or writers and editors to put together all these magazines, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
No, I mean, the Moscow Times by that time, after like 1-2 years, was like a small part of our operation. It all started with the Moscow Times,
right?
But the Moscow Times, never became, it became break even at best. But these magazines were so profitable that we could afford to keep spending on the Moscow Times.
Yeah, so Moscow Times was like your baby, so to speak, and
still is.
Okay, yeah. So it was the labor of love, and the other magazines were the real business. Yeah,
right. Absolutely.
Okay.
But I must say also extremely important for Russia. I think that Cosmopolitan is that's maybe a little bit underestimated, but the impact that Cosmopolitan has had during that period, it cannot be overstated. The Cosmopolitan was the first to openly write about sex and relations between men and women in Russia. Domestic violence, was an issue that for the first time was discussed openly. We had tons of letters from readers saying, I had after reading Cosmopolitan, I decided to throw my husband out of the house.
Wow.
I'm fed up with being abused.
Wow.
We wrote extensively about abortion. You know, in those days, every Russian woman had, like, I think, an average of 3 abortions or something.
Yeah. It was a method of birth control.
Yeah, it was a form of birth control.
Yeah.
So, and all this, because every young woman in Russia read Cosmopolitan. You know, they shared the magazine. You know, because it was expensive for them, especially in the regions. But they would buy together one copy, and it would go from hand to hand. It was just a Bible for young women, and the impact is absolutely amazing. I think it justifies a separate PhD.
I agree.
Study or something.
I agree. This is what I meant when I said it. It's impossible to convey this era in one book. And I'm hoping that what I'm going to do with this book, including things that you're talking about the media, is sort of lay some breadcrumbs for future PhD students and people to study this period. So,
So and then we launched one magazine after the other,
right?
And we grew from 20 people to well over 1,000 employees in a couple of years.
Wow. And you must have, did you move to your own building? Did you have a headquarters?
Well, first we actually, when we grew a little bit, we moved from Slavianskaya, which by that time became a real hotel.
Right.
So, we needed to vacate there. And we moved to Ulica Pravda. So we became the neighbors of Komsomolskaya Pravda.
Okay.
So we were in the heart of the Soviet press.
Right.
And we took over a huge space, which was the former accounting department of Pravda. It was quite funny and historic.
Right.
But then we grew more and more, and then we moved to we rented an office space, a building, a whole building, a little bit off Leningradsky Prospect.
Yeah, and so I have about 10 questions in my mind at once, so I'm gonna slow down and ask them properly. And so, what was the name of the parent company that was behind all of these ventures? Was there one?
Yeah, so we called the company. The company was owned by myself and my friend.
Yeah.
And we called it Independent Media.
Independent Media. Okay. So you were self-consciously blazing a new trail for media in Russia. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the others that followed behind you, your competitors, particularly in the newspaper space.
Well, I would say in the newspaper space, there was one other very important newspaper, and that was Kommersant. Because that was a little bit what we did in the magazine side. Kommersant did on the newspaper side. So they were the first. It was started by a guy called Vladimir Yakovlev, who was actually the grandson of the famous Yakovlev, the partner of Gorbachev.
Wow, the academician. Yeah.
So Volodya Yakovlev, and he came up with the idea to make a a newspaper for the new emerging Russian business class. And the newspaper was, was independent. It was not linked to any state organizations, but also the writing was much more eclectic. So it attracted. It was just not, all these boring articles in the Pravda and Izvestia and so on.
Right.
So this was something new, lively. Writers and intellectuals wrote in it, apart from the news side. And it was just a very exciting newspaper for this emerging middle class.
Right.
Yakovlev really caught the time at that moment for this emerging middle class, and that was the Bible for, you wanted to be seen with commerçant if you wanted to go ahead in society at that time.
Right. Well, and so by let's say by 1996, 98, that period, how many expats would you estimate were there in Moscow?
I think at the top there were. We thought. I mean, there were no exact numbers.
Right.
But we estimated between 50 and 60,000.
50 to 60,000. Yeah, and of all nationalities.
Yeah. Of course.
Yeah. So what about? Let me ask you about a couple of other media. So there was also the Moscow News that was started by the AJ was Indian.
The Indian guy. It was not Moscow News. It was Moscow Tribune.
Okay. Yeah.
The Moscow News also existed, but that was a very old Soviet from the Soviet days.
Right.
And the Moscow News was in both Russian and English. They stopped actually the English part, but the Russian part, it was the newspaper in the glasnost time. So a little earlier, in the late 80s, early 90s, people were standing in line. It was once a week, and people were standing in line to get the Moscow News. So that is a totally different thing.
Yeah.
But the Moscow Tribune was, but I don't know. I never took that. It wasn't good journal. It wasn't good, solid journalism. Don't forget, we had a very good team of journalists. We had Meg Borton as the editor in the early days, who came from the Herald Tribune. We had, and all these people actually went on and became all very famous journalists. We had Steve Leisman, who is a business editor, who's now one of the senior people at CNBC. We had Karen Duquesne, who's now a famous writer in the US. We had Lynn Berry, now New York Times correspondent, Pulitzer Prize winner. We had a whole list of young people, and almost all of them, without exception, went on to become stars in their fields.
Right. So this was a launching pad for training for young journalists. Then.
Yeah, we got what we said and what I still say. It's a small newspaper about the big story.
Yeah.
And even to this day, I mean, now still, our coverage, for instance, now about COVID in Russia is unrivaled and being quoted all over the world. So, yeah, I mean, but certainly in those early days without internet and anything,
right?
We had this team of very ambitious young people, right there,
Right.
We had people reporting from the White House when it was bombed, and you name it, So
Right. Right.
yeah,
Right. So you all through these famous, 1993 Yeltsin election in '96 and 1998,
the
you covered.
crisis, yeah, we
Yeah.
covered everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and just to finish the earlier stuff, what about exile? What was your opinion about exile?
Well, I mean, they were like this, they were quite talented actually, but totally over the top.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, they saw us as boring, old-fashioned journalists, and we were proud of being boring, old-fashioned journalists.
Right. Right. Right.
Because that was our mission, to
Right.
have. We were not gonzo journalists, They were, they saw themselves as, what's his name? Fear and Loathing in Las
Right.
Vegas.
Hunter Thompson. Yeah. Yeah.
David Thompson, so.
Yeah.
And I don't drink, and I go home at night and go to bed,
Right.
and just make sure that everything we write is balanced and correct and checked and double checked. And
Right.
they thought that was all bullshit.
Yeah.
Old fashioned.
Yeah. Old fashioned. Yeah. So, what about?
It turned out also that they were very sexist, but that is.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question about that. And so they were never really a competitor. They were sort of a adjunct to a certain section, I'd say, of the expat community. They represented
there was
a certain
bar. There was this bar. I can't even remember the name.
The Hungry Duck.
Hungry Duck. Right, here we are.
Yes.
So
yeah.
People danced on the tables and and scoring girls and stuff. So that was their scene. And our scene was just people, the expat community, people who work hard to build a business, Russians who were interested in joining foreign companies, and good old solid journalism.
Yeah. And your foreign staff members, did they typically speak Russian or not?
Yeah, that was not in the first 2 years because those people weren't there, but pretty soon, it was a requirement for people to join to speak Russian. And so we got more and more people who either were Russian studies people, so they had done university, or more and more people who came from Russian background. So kids from immigrants who grew up at home speaking Russian, but went to American universities or European universities. So now in the newsroom, everyone speaks Russian.
Right. And so you had to develop your own sources of information, just like traditional reporters.
Yeah. I mean, we were good old, and that's what I have always maintained over all those 30 years now. That the most of the times it's serious journalism. Everything we write about is with authority and
right.
No nonsense.
Right. Well, of course, I read the paper in those days, and because I wasn't living there, I was traveling back and forth, and I wasn't staying in hotels, so I would go to the hotels in order to pick it up, and because it was the best source of information for me. My Russian was fairly primitive, so I couldn't spend a lot of time reading Russian papers.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so were you close to other institutions like the AmCham and the European Business Club and other organizations like that. Was there any special relationship with those organizations?
No, we were, of course, we used their information but no, because we always tried to stay, independent so, just, I would say just like the same relationship a Boston or a New York or whatever newspaper would have with the local chamber of commerce.
Right. So, okay. Nothing particularly special.
No.
Okay. All right. And what about the organization Internews? Did you have any interaction with them?
Yes, but that had nothing to do with the Moscow Times. They were very nice people, and we for a while we had our own training center, because as big part of what we did, because we had to hire all these people, and we never hired journalists, Russian journalists, because I knew that once people had gone through this Russian journalism, it would be impossible to get them to write as we want them to write. And it was for the Moscow Times, but also for our magazines. So what we wanted is fresh people from university, either linguistics or arts or whatever, as long as they were young and very energetic.
Yeah.
And then we set up our own training institute. So they all went through, the very basics of our style of journalism, and we have done this for years and years and years. So we had our own academy, and we work with Internews also a little bit on this for training of journalists from the regions.
Right. Okay. So I mean, their involvement was mostly with TV stations, as I understand it. So I mean, I've spoken with several of those people. So they also seem to be an important impact on independent media,
local TV stations.
Yeah. And so the magazines were the economic basis, and for how long? I know the Moscow News is still publishing, and
Moscow Times.
Moscow Times. So I really apologize for that. But what about the magazines? Did you keep control of the magazines, or for how long were those sort of part of your?
So let's not forget I think of one of the most important things I did. So the Moscow Times was doing okay, not making real money, but was doing okay. Then we had these magazines, and then I always had this dream of starting a Russian language newspaper.
Okay.
And for a while, I thought about maybe doing Moscow Times in Russian. But I saw that Kommersant, who started in the beginning under Yakovlev as this new thing for the Russian middle class and business community, that they really drifted away a little bit. Yakovlev left. What's his name? The famous oligarch, the Mercedes dealer turned oligarch turned.
Who? Oh, Berezovsky.
Berezovsky.
Yeah.
He bought the paper from Yakovlev. So, and it, then it became an oligarch newspaper. So I sensed there was a market there. And so I came up with the idea to start a real serious business newspaper in Russia.
Uh-huh.
And I have big admiration for two newspapers in the world, the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal. And I wanted to do it with either the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
So first I went to the Financial Times in London. London is closer. And I met the chairman there. And he was intrigued by the idea and said, yeah, good idea, let's do it, and so on. But, as these things go, you go back and, you send emails, not emails in those days, but you send messages. Right. And nothing really happened.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, then I go to the Wall Street Journal. So I went to New York, met the chairman of the Wall Street Journal. Same thing, intriguing idea, blah, 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 but nothing happened. So at a certain point, I was like, what do I do? So I called them both and I said, I have an idea. Why don't we do it all together?
Uh-huh.
Because what I sensed was that on the one hand, they wanted to go to Russia because Russia was not toxic yet at that time. Right. But at the same time, they were a little nervous about failure.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So I said, if it's a success, you both have the success. If it's a failure, you share the failure.
Right. Right.
So you get out of this without, real problems.
Right.
And to my surprise, they said yes. Wow. And this is how I started Vedomosti.
Okay. Okay.
I don't know how familiar you are with Vedomosti, but Vedomosti was actually the biggest success of what I did.
Really? Yeah.
I mean, Cosmopolitan was the biggest success in circulation, but in impact also, Vedomosti was the first truly independent business newspaper in Russia.
Uh-huh.
And it was launched. Hold on, let me see. I'll look at the internet. Vedomosti. It was launched in 1999.
Oh, okay. So this was after the crisis.
It was right in the middle of the crisis.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
So people thought we were completely crazy.
Yeah.
But we had gone through other crises, and I understood that crisis is the best time to launch something.
Uh-huh.
Because A, no one else is launching something.
Right.
So you have a lot of attention.
Yeah.
B, your marketing costs are much lower. Billboards, everything is almost for free.
Yeah.
And you have time to build it up. Because, people understand that it will take a little time for it to become a success, if you want.
Right, right.
But with Vedomosti, we launched, and we had big billboards all over Moscow, because this was the time. By that time, 1999, it was the heydays of the oligarchs.
Yeah, right.
They were running the show.
Right.
So we had big billboards. It said, every oligarch can buy this newspaper in the kiosk.
Uh-huh.
So it immediately sent the message, this paper is not for sale.
Yeah.
Kommersant was owned by Berezovsky. NTV was owned by Guzinski. First Channel was owned also by Berezovsky. So all the oligarchs, they ran the media in those days, remember?
Right.
And here we came with a newspaper co-published by the two most famous newspapers in the world, the FT and the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
Saying, this paper is not for sale by anyone.
Uh-huh.
And this was a whole new thing. And this was like serious business journalism you couldn't get it more serious.
Right.
And in the beginning, people thought, said, this will never fly. This is Russia. You will be bribed. The journalists will be bribed. This and that. But we had a very good team. We had a very good young editor. The editor was like 23 or something.
Wow.
Very young guy. Leonid Brzezinski. He's now one of the top people at Bloomberg. And we just did it, and it became extremely successful, both financially, but also in terms of influence.
Was it the orange paper, like Financial
Yeah, the
Times?
pink paper, right?
Yeah, the pink paper, like Financial Times.
Yeah.
Which is, I get it home. This is my paper, is Financial Times. So, okay, so I remember it. I remember the pink color, which also made it distinctive. Right. And it became kind of the paper of record for the.
It was the paper of record in Russia.
Yeah,
it was the paper of record in Russia.
Right.
So if I look back on everything I did, that's probably, so my wife deserves the credit of Cosmopolitan. She was also the editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan. So it was a real family business.
Right. Yeah.
So she basically made all the money, and I created both the Moscow Times and this Vedomosti success story.
And so tell me about the arc of Vedomosti. I mean, it was launched. It started to become successful. Meaning, what was roughly a circulation numbers? How did
so we started with like 30,000. We started small. It went up. It never was really big. It it was like 100,000 circulation maximum. But everyone, from the president down to all the CEOs, all the important people, everyone was reading this newspaper.
Yeah. And so when you said it's your biggest success was because it had the most influence.
Right.
Yeah. And
I mean, it was like the impact that the New York Times has in the US, Vedomosti in Russia.
Yeah. That's huge. And how involved were you with Vedomosti in terms of setting editorial priorities or doing any reporting or writing yourself?
I didn't, I never did reporting for my own newspapers, magazines. I was the publisher. But I was, of course, very involved. And I think my biggest involvement was to, first of all, protect the journalists.
Right.
Because there was always pressure from everywhere, to write something or more important, not to write something.
Right.
And to give them the confidence that they could work in freedom, and encourage them to be brave but at the same time responsible. So, I always, I think the uniqueness of our company was that, I always said you can write everything you want, but this brings a huge responsibility, and that is that it has to be 100% correct.
Yeah.
So we were very sharp on sourcing, on not, all the sources had to be named or had to be known with the editors or the main editors. So you see so often like a source told, blah blah blah.
Right.
We never did that. It had to. So there's a lot of stories we never published because we just couldn't put the sources on the record, or we didn't have more than we needed. I insisted we need 3 sources if not all the names could be named and so on. So we were very, very rigid in our journalism.
Right. So, and I think I know the answer to this, but do you need to take that?
No.
All right. did you ever have, and particularly in the early days, have an issue of Krisha, of needing
Yes,
some? Yeah,
we actually had.
yeah.
So in 1994, I befriended a guy called Yuri Milner.
I know that name is famous guy. Yeah,
He now is one of the richest internet investors in the world. He's a billionaire.
right.
At that time, he was working for Khodorkovsky.
Uh-huh.
This was before Yukos. It was still Menatep.
Okay.
And he was doing investments for Khodorkovsky. So he worked for Menatep. And I got, we had some really bad experiences with the mafia. We were threatened. One of our photographers was beaten up by some ugly guy. The editor of Playboy was shot in front of our building.
Wow.
I got many threats. So I thought it was time to sort of, look for, some Grisha.
Krisha, yeah.
But of course, I heard all these horrible stories about Grishas and how they took over your business and so on. So I decided on a little different approach. And when I met with Yuri, he suggested that Menatep would take a stake in our company. So we agreed on a 10% stake. So
Yeah.
they paid us for it. Was the first money we actually made. The first time we sold some part of our business. And I, had in the purchase agreement, there was very long clauses about that they could not be involved in any editorial matters, and that they had no say over who worked for us, and it was a very long contract.
Right.
And that's how I got to know Khodorkovsky quite well, because he became the shareholder. And I must say, in the years that they were shareholder, they behaved very well.
Uh-huh.
Because the Moscow Times was in those days reporting about Menatep, and then Yukos was criticized heavily on the way they treated minority shareholders.
Right.
And we wrote about it extensively.
Uh-huh.
And I cannot say that Khodorkovsky and the guys at Yukos were happy about it, but they never pressured or interfered in this.
That's interesting. Yeah. So that was quite a different kind of behavior than one would expect from an oligarch. Yeah.
Yeah. But I must say, I've been always very, very clear, what the deal was. Right. So any suggestion, if there was a suggestion, I would immediately, say, right. God, this is what we agreed. If you don't like it, I'll buy back the shares immediately.
Yeah. And so they provided you the Krisha.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing was if people would come to me, and people were coming to you all the time in those days, and would say you need protection, and then I would always say, just don't talk to me, go to Menatep or go to Yukos, and the story was over.
Right.
I understood, that don't bother these guys, so. It was extremely effective, I must say.
Right. And the shooting of the Playboy editor was when? What years was that?
So that was in 95, 96.
95, yeah. And was that person killed?
He was not killed, thank God. He was paralyzed.
Wow.
But he recovered, and he became a big yogi guy. So He's a yoga instructor now.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. But so that was after you started your relationship with Minitech. This happened, this shooting.
No, this was yeah, it was around the same time.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. And what were there other kinds of political pressures that were put on you at those days?
Well, I would say during the Chechen War, the first we had Ellen Berry, very famous New York Times writer now. She was in Chechnya covering the war for us, and we had a lot of heat from the government. But more than it never resulted in any concrete measures against us. I mean, they were grumbling and saying we don't like what you do, but they never try to close us down or do something, unpleasant.
Yeah. So I want to. So Vedomosti, what's the state of Vedomosti now? How long did it last? How long did this period of influence last?
Well, so I sold. So the whole company, it became a really big company, and in hold on, I'll check the date. Because all these dates are, I don't remember all of them by heart. In 2005. I over the years I got many offers to buy the company from international publishers, but in 2005 we decided to sell the company to a Finnish group called Sanoma.
Okay.
And then I stayed for 3 more years as chairman of the company. So I left sort of 2008, 2009. So certainly until that day, all the magazines and everything was still doing very well. And under Sanoma also, it sort of continued.
Right.
Sanoma is a very good Finnish, publishing group. They're quite big and solid and so on. But then we're now moving into the Putin era.
Yeah.
And around 2005 or so, 6, a new law was introduced to the foreign media law was introduced. And then foreign companies weren't allowed anymore to own more than 30%, 20% of a company.
Right.
So, and that was the beginning of the end of many media companies.
Yeah.
So if after a couple of years, FT and Wall Street Journal decided to leave, Hearst decided to leave. As a joint venture partner, so slowly but surely, as Sanoma decided to leave the country altogether, sold off the assets to several different groups. So independent media basically fell apart.
Oh, I see. And but Moscow Times stayed with you?
No, so Moscow Times and Vedomosti both were sold to a Russian entrepreneur called Damian Kudratsev, who actually is a former director of Venomsty, of Commerçant.
Uh-huh.
And he has some other businesses. So he bought Venomsty and Commerçant, Venomsty and the Moscow Times.
Right.
He held it for a couple of years. Then the Moscow Times he wasn't interested in at all. I met him in London by accident, actually, at a conference. And we started talking, and he said, this Moscow Times is just, not my thing. And I said, well, then, I'll take it back from you. So I took back the Moscow Times like 4 years ago. So now it's, it's still with me. And then Venomsty, he controlled until last summer when he sold Venomsty to a Rosneft connected business person, which was a guy who was close to Sechin.
Yeah. Okay. Got it.
And this created a big scandal in Russia.
Yeah.
The editor, because the new editor that was appointed immediately, took the Kremlin line and said, no more independent reporting and so on. So by that time, as I said, FT and Wall Street Journal were already long gone. They had connection anymore. So it was just Venomsty. But still, doing quite okay. So the editors rebelled. They left. They all resigned from Venomsty, and they came to me, and we started together a new project called V Times.
V Times,
yeah. which was launched in October last year.
Wow.
And actually it was a very flying start because a lot of, all the journalists joined, a lot of readers joined. And in Russia it was a big thing, and it became actually quite successful until a month ago when the government declared both V Times and the foundation. I formed a foundation in the Netherlands, and the foundation that supported V Times, a foreign agent, and basically forced us to close down V Times.
Wow. Yeah.
So I've gone through this whole cycle of first founding V Times, then seeing V Times being taken over by the Kremlin, founding Venomsty, then seeing Venomsty taken over by the Kremlin. Then those people came back to me, creating a new platform, and that being closed down by the Russian government.
Yeah, yeah. So, wow. And so, have they threatened to shut down Moscow Times?
No, not yet.
Yeah. Do you expect it?
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So you have scanned the whole period of independent journalism from beginning to nearly end.
Yeah. And then in the meantime, that's another episode, because when I left independent media in 2010 or 11, I was invited by another oligarch called Prokhorov, Mikhail Prokhorov, who is well known in the US because,
the NBA Nets, and he sold them, to a Chinese guy, by the way.
Chinese guy, right.
Yeah.
So he called me and he said he was the owner of a Russian platform called RBK, very big media company, internet, newspapers, magazines, a lot of people, but losing money, and also it was well known of being corrupt and not professional, and so on. So he called me and said, Derk, can you help me? We knew each other socially. Can you help me? Can you become the new CEO of Eboka? So I worked there for 6 years as CEO and chairman of this company. We had like 2,500 staff.
Yeah.
Brought in a whole new team, all former Venomous people. And became commercially extremely successful, but also journalistic very successful. So Eboka became, after Venomous, actually the new #1 media in Russia. And we had a lot of breaking stories, and it was it was a great time. Again, until the Kremlin got really pissed off. And one day they raided our offices and all the offices of Prokhorov's businesses, started legal procedures against us, this and that. And the bottom line was Prokhorov was forced to sell the company to a more pro-Kremlin oriented guy.
Right.
And as a result, all the top editors left Eboka. I left the Eboka as chairman and CEO. So that was also an episode where I, sort of, realized really good journalism that was then destroyed by the Kremlin.
Yeah. Wow. So you say it sort of very dispassionately.
Well, I said I'm an objective journalist, So
right. You're objective about your own fate as well.
Yeah, exactly. What can we do? So this is today's Russia.
Yeah, yeah. And so, so when speculating a little more about the influence of all this, it seems that institutionally the independence has been lost for journalism, but it seems to me at the same time the underlying impact of all this has been pretty dramatic in terms of life values, lifestyle, the integration of Russia into sort of more global discussions of these things. I mean, is that a fair statement that the integration that was assisted by this independent media was pretty profound?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think, if you look at the net result now of like free media, of course, that's basically closed.
Right.
But if you look at how people think and behave, and how they, consume on the internet and YouTube and social media and everything, then that's really, to a large part, the result of what the independent media they did the groundwork for that,
Right.
And so it's not just hopeless. I'm not, of course, for myself, the companies I built basically have been destroyed again, because of of the repression. But the spirit has not been destroyed.
Yeah. And so this impact, do you think it lasts beyond, say, the current generation that experienced this? I mean, you had trained all these journalists. You've put ideas out through the various magazines and journals, and now we have the repression of the cutting off of that independence.
But
so is the impact of what you've done and what of this period only last as long as the lifetime of this generation?
no,
or is there something
no,
more?
no. I think because the new generation is I would say even more hungry for what's going on in the rest of the world.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, so and technology, of course, has changed everything.
yeah.
So when I started, there was no technology. We still used lead to print the newspaper.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And now everything is technology. Also,
yeah.
even ourselves with the Moscow Times, it's only digital. We don't print anymore.
Right.
So the technology has changed everything. Also, in the US and Europe, but also in Russia.
Yeah,
And the technology, of course, has changed the lifestyle and the mentality of people. And it's even for more authoritarian societies like Russia, it's impossible to suppress it.
thank you very much. It's been a great interview and insight into those times, and which I hope we can do something to preserve.
Good.
Yeah, set the stage for whatever happens next by the young people. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Good.
Good.
Okay. Thank you very much, and we'll stay in touch.
We'll stay in touch. Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
All right. Take care.